Hello, my dear players. Today, we're going to be talking about villains in D&D. And, talking about a few different types of villains. You know, there's the really just one-note villains that you're probably only going to use for, like, that one random town that has a problem person. You know, use it just that one off, doesn't matter. And we're also going to be talking about some more almost BBG-like figures as well, and also something else that I greatly enjoy making is character-specific villains. You know, making a villain for a PC to go up against. And I'll give you an example of that. And actually, we'll start off with that, because I think that's probably what I feel most passionate about. You see, what makes a villain good? I'll talk more generally about villains, about how to write a villain. What makes a villain or an antagonist good is really just how do they relate to the character that is the protagonist, or how do they relate to the character they are a villain of. Now, the easiest, simplest way that is done is just saying the protagonist is good, the antagonist is evil, and that is how they relate to each other, and that they are opposites in that sense. And that's the simplest way to do it. It's not a bad way to do it. Not a bad way to do it at all. Especially if that villain's not going to be anything special. It's just going to be something to fight against and not really serve much of a greater purpose. Yeah, that's perfectly fine in a D&D game. But we can do more complicated things. Have a great deal of fun. And even if you don't necessarily make them good in some capacity, like trying to make them nuanced, you can still make a incredibly evil, hateable character that still relates back to the character they are a villain of in a very interesting, dynamic manner. An example of this might be, off the top of my head, just making one up instead of using one that I've used, is that if you have a character, if you have a game that is okay with talking about racial issues, then a pretty obvious way to make a very dynamic villain is that if you have a character that has faced a lot of racial discrimination and a lot of their background as a character focuses around that fact, then making a villain that is the truest version of a racist archetype and playing that as hard as possible, while that would be just a plain evil, that would just be a purely evil character if you play that archetype to its fullest. Just the fact that it is this kind of perfect flip of that character can make it feel really dynamic and interesting. And I think you can pretty easily see other examples from that, but a character-specific example that I'll use, that it's a bit more nuanced, but I think is worth talking about, is, I'll give the vague example, then a specific example, is that you'll have the vague idea of two characters, is that you have an antagonist who is the same as the protagonist, up until one crucial difference, which makes them diametrically opposed. And an example of this I'll give is something I've actually used. So, one PC that I have DM'd for was a Circle of Spores druid known as Eli. Eli was an individual who not only was, a druid, obviously, but he practiced with spores and fungi, but he worshipped fungi. It saved, in his backstory, fungi saved his life, long story. And now he dedicates his life to it. He dedicates his life to spreading it, to try and make people appreciate fungi and everything that it does. Very fun character, very fun little silly concept. And now, what I did... one of the flaws of Eli is that Eli isn't that smart. Eli is fairly wise, but in certain respects, but wasn't very smart. Didn't have the ability to intellectually think through the consequences of his beliefs much. So he didn't quite fully grasp the full consequences of what his love of fungi could mean, or what valuing fungi over other parts of nature could look like. So I made a villain that I named Father Net. And Father Net was a person who had a very similar life to Eli. Someone who had a tragic backstory and was saved by fungi and decided to dedicate his life to it in the same way that Eli did, to worship it the same way Eli did, to cherish and love it the same way Eli does. But the way they depart is that Father Net is smart enough to think through his beliefs, is smart enough to understand what would be the intellectual conclusion of such a belief. What would you want to do if you truly valued fungi over everything else? Then you would want to replace nature with fungi. And when fungi would not want to replace the rest of nature, then he would just corrupt fungi so that it could replace nature, so that it would do it, even if it didn't want to. And that's the core of what's wrong with Father Net in Eli's eyes when Eli begins to understand him. And it's actually a very fun dynamic that played out, is that in encountering Father Net, there was a decent chance of Eli actually being recruited by him. But it was more that Eli had a certain internal moral compass that he could grasp, kind of able to tell that something wasn't quite right with what he was doing. And he kind of came to this conclusion through battling Father Net, through encountering him time and time again, that fungi has its place. While it should be cherished, it should not go beyond its place, and it should just be there. It should just be cherished as another part of nature, not any more special, but not any less either. And that was kind of the end of Eli's arc, is realizing that and then defeating Father Net. And the player loved it. It's a very dynamic and interesting situation for them. And yeah. So that's like a character-specific villain, where I essentially just took the character of one at the party and just extrapolated an entire villain concept from them. And that's something I encourage to do. It's really fun, is using villains as a way not just to create conflict, but also create interesting character development, because a good villain can make you see things about yourself when you've made it right. And that's what Father Net did. And so I encourage that if you ever want to make like a really compelling villain that's like long-standing and for a specific character, then another way is to use this way of just taking their ideology, taking that player's ideology, and just spinning it in a direction that is evil, but not necessarily in a way that they initially can say is horrible, because maybe they haven't really thought about what it would mean. Another example of this this isn't a specific example, but something more broad, is that if you have a character who proclaims to believe in a certain sense of greater good, who would, kill one to save two, then simply create a villain who is doing that, but on a significantly larger scale. Someone who will kill 1,000 to save 2,000 without hesitation. Use that same logic. Scale it up. Take it to its logical conclusion and see how uncomfortable it can make that character. Because it will. Because a lot of times, when we conceptualize a character's morality, we think about it only in a certain logical space. We don't think about it past a certain point. So, when making a villain for a specific character, take their morality past that certain point, and you'll almost always get a villain. Like almost any sense of morality taken to a certain extreme gets you a villain, pretty much. And so yeah, that's a really, really good way to make a compelling villain for a specific character. Now, for making a more simple one-note kind of villain that may only be around for like one quest or two quests, and the whole party can get behind, this isn't that hard. But generally, you just make them pretty. Because the thing is that unless your characters unless the PCs wanna sit there for way longer to essentially grant them being fleshed out, you're probably not gonna have time for anything too complicated, for like a nuanced dynamic. And even if you did, it may not be something your players necessarily want to do. They may not necessarily want to deal with a nuanced serial killer. They may not actually engage with it in the way you want them to. So it might be best. So a lot of times when you're doing a singular quest villain that isn't going to be around much, probably best to give them one-note personalities and a one-note motivation, just enough to make it interesting and be prepared to have nuance if they engage with it in that sense. But don't try to hang it over them too much, because players that want nuance will put it there, and players that don't want nuance will smash it to the ground. And that's just the case, at least in my experience. So yeah, what's a good example of a one-note villain I've done? I don't do this type of villain. For this type of thing, I usually use monsters. Literal, just monsters. Things like hags and shit. Hags. Alright, there was a bit of a noise disturbance. I am so sorry about that. I don't know if it came through on the mic, but it definitely distracted me. But I am too deep in this recording to start over. So we're just rolling with it. But yeah, I usually use monsters. If I'm going to use what is essentially a one-note villain, I'm usually going to use a monster, something that has a lot of excuses to not be too nuanced. While at the same time, there's a lot of ways to make it nuanced. A good example of that would be from The Witcher 3 is actually a good example. In The Witcher 3, I think one of the first things you fight is a griffin. It's one of the first things you hunt. But, there's a little bit of a weird thing to it when you investigate in that, it doesn't make sense for the griffin to be attacking the main roads or to be bothering the town directly. Griffins don't usually act like that. And then, when you investigate, as part of you trying to figure out how to kill it, you figure out, the townsfolk tried to deal with the problem themselves before, and they ended up killing the griffin's mate and smashing their eggs. that's why it's willing to attack the main roads, because it's angry. That's something they did. And that's actually a very good way. That's a very good example of a way to add nuance to a monster character, in that, it may not have much personality, it may not have much thoughts that are reasonable, but you can pretty easily make a situation where you kind of feel bad that the monster is like this. But yeah, I'm trying to think of a different example of a one-note kind of villain to face. Mad mages are fun. Just someone who's gone crazy, or someone who's gone crazy in general. Although that does open the door for nuance as well, and that, like, why are they crazy? In what ways are they crazy? Is there anything left under there? And depends on the group of players you have. See how they engage with that, though. Some players will just kill a mad mage immediately. They're crazy, they're a problem, they're dead. Others would want to investigate, know why they're crazy, try to figure it out. It just kind of depends on your party. And yeah, I don't think there's much else to say about the more one-note side of things. Now, as for BBEGs, this, I would say, is the hardest to make general suggestions and rules for, just because of how many ways there are to do it and how dependent on the campaign it is. Because similar to the character-specific villain, a BBEG needs to be pretty directly relevant to the party as a whole, not a specific character, but all of them. And I guess it depends on the campaign, but generally speaking, you're also going to want to make them in such a way that there is no compromise, there is no negotiation, there is no like the ending of the game will not end in diplomacy and the BBG stepping down. The game ends with you probably killing them or stripping them of power. So it becomes a little strange in trying to build one. And I think that the best advice that I can probably give to someone about how to build this type of overarching villain is to just not do it at the beginning of the game. This feels weird, but just have a vague flavor for a BBG thought out. Maybe you want it to be a lich, maybe you want it to be a tyrant king, maybe you want it to be a dragon, whatever. Something where you're like, oh, this is kind of the flavor that I want the end game to take. And then as your players are making decisions throughout the campaign, and as things are being built up about this, mysterious BBG figure, just kind of gauge your players and how they're interacting with things, and then try to write your BBG around that. Because I think you might run into trouble with, more so than your other villains, with your BBG maybe not being interacted with in the way you want them to. Because, in the case of the one-note villain, if you mess up writing the one-note villain and your players don't engage with it in the way that you quite wanted them to, that you quite expected them to, it's okay. It was a villain that was only going to exist for one quest anyway. It's not the end of the world. Learn better next time. And a character-specific villain, you're building the villain straight from that character. So it's kind of hard to mess that up. But a BBG, that's a lot. That's supposed to have a lot of narrative weight and power behind it. So, yeah, the best thing I can just do is just come up with a flavor that you want, like I said, and then just build them around the party's actions. Oh, your party seems very willing to trust people. Make your BBG a liar. If just make that a big part of their persona, that they lie, that they deceive, that they cheat. Oh, your characters are liars and deceivers and cheaters? Make the BBEG one that is immune to such bullshit, or maybe has a grudge against people who do such things. Whatever, and just on every axis that you can kind of try and find something interesting to add to the BBG from your players, I recommend going for it. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't really think of much more to say about a BBG. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I know I didn't give any examples of BBGs I've ran, which I apologize. I'm just running a little low on time for this video. If y'all would like to hear me talk about any big bad evil guys that I've actually ran and used, feel free to let me know, and I'll mention them. I'll make a video or something. But yeah, hope y'all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Please like and subscribe.